Okay, don't make me laugh. Hello, everyone. My name is Dubravka Sekulic. I'm a program lead for MA City Design and a host of these conversations, City Design and Conversation. In this sequence, happening under the title Minor Planning, which is something that we are thinking through in our program, and something that I'm also trying to think through as a proposition of how do we think about future of cities and how do we manage and plan them, and that goes beyond already existing approaches, but also really it recognizes that a lot of dispositions and potentials that already exist in existing communities and neighborhoods, and recognizing this and finding ways to uphold and empower and build political capacity for people to really actively engage with what their everyday life is one of the future roles of spatial practitioners that we often call urban designers, architects, city planners, but more than just those who are working on this and expertise. And it's, in this context, I'm very, very happy that I have an opportunity to have these conversation with Adam Greenfield, because one thing that kind of we share, and I recognize in his work, which has been incredibly important for shaping some of my thinking, is that it's precisely in the relationship between space and everyday life that politics forms, and that it is where people are mostly dispossessed of their own agency, but this is how we have to figure out ways to support different political agency that really starts from supporting everyday life as something that is the most precious thing, and prioritizing that and not profit margins and dispossession and separation. There is many ways one can introduce Adam, and some of the main, and I won't go through his official bio because you all know it, as it was in the announcement of this conversation. I will start with a little bit of an anecdote. Last year, a friend from Chicago shared with me a link to a YouTube sermon by a priest who was holding in his hand Adam's book, Lifehouse, just when it was published, and using it really to discuss what is the role of churches in the future society, especially churches that are especially churches which can be actually seen as a spatial network. They exist as relatively equally spaced around neighborhoods, but often, especially in the context of Western Europe and UK or Western world, are underused, and because they're underused, they often suffer from lack of maintenance, and not all. And then there is all this kind of understanding that churches can become something else, but not all churches can or should become exclusive restaurants, hotels, or bookshops. And the reason why this priest was holding his Adam's book, and this church in the meantime has voted to rename itself into a Lifehouse, is that that the proposal of the Lifehouse really resonated with not only with the priest, but also with the understanding that puts in words and into imagination what future of city neighborhood life can be, and what it needs to, what spatial equipment we need in order for this to happen. And this is the brilliance of Adam's book proposal, to first think about what is needed as a new social infrastructure to support collective life in a moment of climate collapse, and then to recognize disposition, potential that already exists in some existing spaces, which also can work as a system and not just an individual objects. So this type of thinking sits at the core of our thinking about minor planning, and which is an attempt to name how we steward cities in the future in the way that supports life of all its inhabitants with coordination, but not with a top-down implementation. Well, this conversation will mostly focus on Adam's proposal on Lifehouse and how it can develop further. I would like to start this conversation by revisiting, Adam, some of your previous work. Uh, One that is much more directly connected to the question of technology and space, and the other previous brilliant book you wrote, Radical Technologies. And both of these books are on the core curriculum for the syllabus of city design. So, what is really was really always amazing for me in Radical Technology was that it was the city was a main focus of your work, and not technology on its own. And but you also don't come from a usual background in which people think of kind of architects, urbanists, and kind of think about space. But you do actually start kind of bring that importance of thinking through space, even when you come from more kind of user interface technology side. So why cities as the main focus of your work, and how technology brought you through this, and how do you understand what technology is today? And in a way that it avoids falling into yet another cycle of idealizing now with AI, what happened previously with smart cities. The technology is the kind of silver bullet that will solve all our problems.
Well, there's a lot there. I should say first that the pastor that you're talking about in Chicago will be familiar to many people in the audience because he became world famous very shortly after that. He is the same pastor that was shot in the head by ICE in Chicago. You will have seen him being pepper sprayed and being hit with less lethal munitions. The pictures of him have circulated worldwide, and I think speak both to his intense personal commitment to the values and beliefs that he wants to uphold, and also his own personal bravery. So his name is David Black, and he's doing incredible things at First Presbyterian in Chicago, and I'm really incredibly moved by his decision to present the Lifehouse notion to his trustees, and try to implement First Church as, in fact, an explicit, concrete lifehouse. We'll come back around to that. Your question about where I come from and how I see the interaction between tools and cities. I have a really heterogeneous, scattered intellectual background. I come from a bunch of different places, but the place where I've spent the majority of the last quarter century is in information technology, and particularly in the design of human interfaces to a class of technologies that I think we think of as network digital information technology. So most prominently the smartphone. I worked at Nokia, right on the cusp of Nokia's failure, right after the introduction of the Apple iPhone, at a moment where both the power and the potential and the promise of this class of technologies was becoming obvious, but it was also an existential threat to those organizations that had been incumbent, had been very, that when I joined Nokia, it was something like 70% of the European market share, 80% in places like China and India. They saw early on how our access to information through the mobile device could transform our interaction with and our use of the city, but they weren't able to fully leverage that understanding. And the organizations that have proven to be some of the most successful capitalist enterprises of all time. They are now trillion-dollar market cap companies, which is surreal and insane to me. Sitting at a spot that I think is reasonable to regard as one of the commanding heights, not merely of the economy, but of human experience over the past 2 decades, has given me a really acute, almost painfully conscious awareness of the power that's involved in the interface to information, how it's delivered to us, how it's captured from us, how it's ducted up off of our activities, how it's analyzed and served back to us in terms of the choices that we have, in terms of the ability that we have to move through urban space, to use it expressively, to use it functionally, to use it politically. And these are questions that some people in that interface paradigm, some people in the technology sector were thinking about and talking about, but not all. And it was a frankly consequential conversation that became marginalized as the rush to market dominance captured everything. The values that I was trying to uphold were very, to me, fairly straightforward, fairly simple, almost not even political. It was about our sovereignty, about our right to the control over our own information, the right to the city, our right to move freely through urban space, to associate as we will, to avoid having our activities captured and mined for information about how to sell things back to us or how to commodify and commercialize our behavior, and ultimately to avoid having the state use that information that's kind of wafting up off of our activities in an attempt to control those activities. And I think that Radical Technologies was, as a book, it was an attempt to remind people what was at stake in the interaction between our embodied selves, the technologies we use, corporate and state control of urban space, and how we experience that manifold of possibilities. It was, as books go, successful. I mean, certainly the publisher was happy with it. It did well. It was reviewed very favorably, but I think it's also fair to regard it as not particularly consequential. I mean, clearly, no book or no set of books of its sort are ever able to move the needle in the way that our access to these devices and the sort of the pleasure that we associate with these devices can.
Yeah, but what is interesting here for me is that you say that that this power of interface, but in this context we can think of space as an interface
Sure.
that really is kind of frames what is possible and what is and even more frames what is not possible to do.
My argument around 2010 was that information delivered to us through a variety of apertures was becoming more salient to our experience of the city, indeed, than the physical interface. That it was the informational fabric that was being layered over the physical city that was beginning to inform our use of it, where we went, how we got there, who we saw there, what we did there. And I think that argument has been borne out fairly successfully.
And, but now in the Lifehouse, you come back to actual physical space,
Yeah.
and we've been mentioning Lifehouse, but not everyone in the room knows about. So can you
Yeah.
the Lifehouse, break down Lighthouse as a proposal in a few sentences, and in the way that it's also really a proposition as a kind of a structural mechanism and not necessarily a form.
Yeah, I absolutely can. And in order to do that, I'm going to tell some biographical stories here. I'm going to kind of
We love biographical stories in
good.
these conversations because they help us understand that knowledge and experience inform what we do, and that when we talk about city design, that's really our lived experience and embodied experience, is really something to tap into and not to pretend that there is an expert knowledge that sits outside of that.
Good. Yeah. No, then this will resonate. This is not a story about expert knowledge at all. It's a story. It starts as a story about failure. After I got back from Finland to New York City in 2010, after I left Nokia behind, after I became frustrated with the pace and the commitments of these large capitalist enterprises intervening in the space of network technologies, I started up my own design practice. It was called Urban Scale, and the tagline of Urban Scale was designed for networked cities and citizens. And the idea was that we were going to grasp these potentials and use them transformatively and affirmatively to enhance our ability as individuals and as collectives to use these new capacities to make life happen in cities, to make expression happen, and to make organization happen. And I failed. I thought, we should be able to express these ideas at the level of a design practice. And I wasn't able to do it. I'm not a business person, it turns out. And I was sitting there in the ashes and the wreckage of my dream for this design practice in the fall of 2012 when something happened to the city that I lived in. And that something was called Superstorm Sandy. It was a collision of two storm systems. One, an Atlantic hurricane, one of the largest and most powerful that had ever been seen at that point, and the other a continental cold front, a continental storm system. And these things came together and fused almost as the hurricane made landfall over New York City. It was a storm so large and so intense that it completely blew the meteorological categories that had been laid for it as an explanatory mechanism out of the water. There was no way that you could account for this as a hurricane. It was a superstorm. And it took New York City utterly down to its knees. All of the structures and infrastructures that we rely upon in the course of everyday urban life to give shape and meaning to our experience, to sustain us, to make life possible, were taken down in a matter of hours. Power networks went down. The streets were unnavigable. Water flooded into subterranean spaces across the city and just made an absolute hash of the power infrastructure, the heating infrastructure, the light infrastructure. The city basically came as close to physical collapse as it is possible to imagine a consequential Western megacity doing. And the brilliant thing is that within, the first 36 hours after this happened, there was a really intense effort to pick the city back up, to house the people that had been displaced, to feed them, to care for them, to warm them. And what we learned really quickly coming back to New York City from the West Coast, where we were, my partner and I, when the storm hit, we arrived back in New York City. We found it in this devastated condition. It was really good to see this effort aimed at restoring people and helping them care for one another. But the effort didn't come from any government agency at all. The effort didn't come from the charitable sector. The effort certainly didn't come from the market. The effort was a spontaneous and self-organized initiative that was launched by people who were veterans of Occupy Wall Street the year before. It was a self-consciously autonomous, anarchist commitment to the values of mutual aid, and it was called Occupy Sandy. And Occupy Sandy, rooted out of two underutilized churches in Brooklyn, turned them into disaster relief and recovery hubs, resilience hubs, started serving hot meals by the tens of thousands, started going out to the sites in the periphery of the city that were hardest hit by the superstorm, getting relief materials out to people, finding out what they needed, giving them access to ways that they could, access care for themselves and begin to take care of one another. And the effort was extraordinarily successful for the next several weeks and months. I think it was pivotal in restoring New York City to full function and preventing the aftermath of the superstorm from being really incredibly dangerous to life and to people's ability to live in the way that they expected to. And that's really where the Lifehouse starts. What is the Lifehouse? The Lifehouse is a physical site in each community that is patterned after these disaster relief and recovery hubs that I saw in Occupy Sandy. It is a place of physical refuge. It is a place of self-organized and autonomous self-care. It's a place that we go to in times of crisis where we take responsibility not merely for sheltering ourselves, for feeding ourselves, for warming ourselves, caring for ourselves, but for doing so for our more vulnerable neighbors as well, and helping them do the same, helping them retain a sense of their own agency, their own dignity, and all of us together, together being able to enact an infrastructure of care at a moment where nobody else is doing that for us. The state isn't there, the market isn't there, the charitable sector isn't able to do it. In moments like this, really what we have recourse to is ourselves as a conscious articulation of our sovereignty. And that is what the Lifehouse is physically meant to enable.
What I can really like about this is that it's a proposal for recomposition of relations, which is not predicated on introducing necessarily immediately starting from scratch and introducing something new, but recomposition that kind of is triggered by, in this case, a necessity, but but also offers different imagination, that it's possible to be also, which imagination, which is both, it's possible to have different forms of social infrastructure and spatial infrastructure, that not everything needs to be a cafe or kind of a service that you pay for.
Yeah.
On one side, on the other side, that it's possible to imagine that to be in different forms of relations with your community around you in collectivity. But and of course these type of things emerge in time, and there is you were drawing this really connection that it's a big kind of shock for the whole system, in which there is a need to kind of take over. So it's connected to mutual aid as an approach. And when I come from the context of former Yugoslavia, where there was a lot of need for self-organization due to wars and the collapse of a society. So there is some tension there in relation to, since the triggers for life houses are often these type of moments of some form of conflict or collapse.
Sure.
And it's connected to mutual aid, and often then emerges out of state of emergency. And when there is a lot of energy, but then how to sustain this idea of Lifehouse as a way of life, which is less focused on the individualism when things are not actively fall apart. And
Yeah, I think that that's a really pointed question, and it's one of the things. So, to kind of continue with this framing, we arrived back in New York City, and my partner and I wanted to volunteer somewhere because that was the fundamental framing that we were given. You volunteer in times of crisis, and we called the American Red Cross immediately, which is the sort of premier charitable organization that intervenes in moments like this, in moments of crisis. And they were, on the verge of abrasive to us. They were like, "Well, we don't want you. We don't need you. We don't have anything for you to do." And almost as an aside, at the end of the conversation, the person that we were on the phone with was like, "Hey, look, there's this church out in Brooklyn. They're doing something out there. Why don't you go, see what they're doing?" And this was one of the two hubs of Occupy Sandy. So we got stuck in immediately. And you're absolutely right. The crisis brought out the best in people. And this is something that we see consistently across all kinds of disasters, both quote unquote natural disasters and the ones which are kind of human made. We see that the organic response generally is not one of nature red in tooth and claw or the war of all against all, as we're told by kind of social contract theory. The response is that we help each other. And there is a way in which people and communities are able to use the crisis as an engine. There's this incredible sense of urgency. There is an incredible sense of need. And the acute need that you're exposed to takes you up and out of your own exhaustion. It powers you through the moments where you might begin to flag in your energy, or you might begin to doubt the point or the purpose of what you're doing, or your commitment to those values. The need is right there. The difficulty arises, and I think it is acknowledged, very broadly acknowledged, that these sort of self-organized, frankly anarchist principles of autonomous mutual aid were extremely effective in the aftermath of Sandy, and have been in the aftermath of many of the disasters that have unfolded in the 15 years or so since. So much so that state entities, study things like Occupy Sandy, and they say, what can we learn from them? What happens, though, is that, to your point, there is a moment where the acute crisis has been weathered. And there is a transition of energy at this point. This is where the logics and the dynamics of everyday life in late capitalism reassert themselves, and the infrastructures of ordinary everyday life are stood back up. And in the space, as quickly as the thing came together, it can begin to delaminate. It can begin to decompose. People go back to their jobs. They go back to their everyday life as sort of consumers of the spectacle of the city. They cease being active co-creators and participants in the molding of urban possibility, and they kind of retreat into the role of sort of passive consumers of it. And so the question that this presents us with is, like, if you believe in the power of these autonomous self-organizing initiatives to transform our sense of agency, our sense of capacity, what sustains them when the crisis passes? And part of my answer, and it's only part of my answer because I don't think there is a global answer yet, and or has been one anywhere, is that it feels really, really good to be agential in your own life. It feels really, really good to expand your capacity, both as an individual and as a member of a community. And you begin to feel this upwelling of what a philosopher might call Spinozan joy. It's the sort of embodied joy that accompanies the expansion of your powers. And that is certainly what I experienced in Occupy Sandy. And it is the alibi for everything else. It really, the secret, the great secret of Occupy Sandy, the great secret of self-organized autonomous mutual aid, is that it feels amazing. And it felt so much better than anything that my life had ever given me before. And I had quite a privileged life, that I thought, why should people be denied this? Why can't we organize more and more of our everyday lives such that people are able to feel competence, capacity, power? Power feels good. And
I
when
mean, I guess that when you say power feels good, I think that there are a lot who draw power out of capacity to obliterate a neighborhood with a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and that's a kind of power. Sure it
Which,
is.
yeah, but I think that here we are interested in such a more kind of different relationships of power. The power that is not about overpowering others, but actually expanding the territory and groups of people who have who can enjoy life. Uh,
Power is constitutive. I mean, this
uh,
is the thing, if we got anything from our reading of Foucault, it should have been that power is not only the boot heel coming down on our neck. Power is also our capacity to resist.
yeah. And a part of commitment to spatial justice, the way that we have it in minor planning and in city design and program, is understanding power relations really seriously, and understanding that despite of the processes of disempowering those who coordinate the processes of design, urban designers and planners, that they still have some power, because to whom they align, that kind of means about, so that redistribution, equitable redistribution of space is also equitable redistribution of power. And then in this way, it's about how do we carry on this agency of people that goes beyond participation, because we know now for
Yeah.
so long that participation in planning processes mostly produces people's part taking into their own dispossession and disempowerment. Um, in this, so I really want us to have a moment to talk about questions around scale, and also what does this proposal for Lifehouse means on to when we think about city design as something that is practiced over time and in a larger territories. But what was striking, but before I want, this is also connected to this kind of historical embedded example. What was really interesting for me is that kind of how you build up a kind of a claim for Lifehouse,
Mm.
not just through that one example, but it learns from many historical examples as things that happened in past. Uh, but it really refuses nostalgia, and this understanding is not about replicating how things looked or that how they operated in the same way, but really challenging how things should be organizing. And it also it was again for me and yet another reminder of how limited spatial transmission of knowledge
Mm.
is, and especially of historical information about built environment really obfuscates what was before. I recently realized that in a in a street that next to the kind of church streets where nearby I live, that in the recent couple of months, all these shops redeveloped and they're new, and I can't even remember anymore what was there before.
Yeah, you
I
can't
kind
remember
of
the shops.
try to pay attention to this. So, can you share a bit about how you approach this learning from past examples and the
Sure.
importance of activating those histories in order to also build these new imaginations? Because, like, Lifehouse is also imagination building project.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Stoke Newington Church Street is a great example. You can't remember the shops that were there before, let alone the fact that that neighborhood was home to the Angry Brigade, the England's most consequential ever urban guerrilla movement, right? There's a political history of the neighborhood that is also effaced beneath the commercial kind of the constant split flap kind of flipping over of storefronts. I'm really glad to hear you say that you thought that my framing refuses nostalgia. I think it does. It's funny, there's this notion in psychogeography that places sort of retain an ineffable essence or trace of past experience. And I don't affirm that claim. I think that my experience is much closer to yours, that when we move through the city, and I don't even think it has to do with late capitalist redevelopment, although that's a part of it, as just human memory. We're finite creatures, and things fade, and they don't leave traces. Or if they do, the salience or the signification of those traces isn't conveyed alongside the physical markers. So we have to actively perform salvage operations. We have to actively, each of us, I think, has a responsibility to do a little bit of history, and to locate in history, not merely the history of place, but history more broadly, the the previous waves of human effort that ground us, that give us, help us understand the meaning of our actions, help us situate those things in time, but also give us pragmatic tactics, a repertoire of tactics, a toolkit that we can reach into and leverage and make use of, so that we're not, in the phrase, constantly reinventing the wheel. It turns out that communities under pressure have always developed techniques to take care of themselves and to help people take care of one another. And there's no reason why we should be kind of inventing these things from scratch every single time we face a crisis. I think another implication of what you're asking is people always say, yeah, but how do you scale it? How do you scale it up? And I have to say that I have an allergy, a pronounced allergy to the rhetoric of scale. Coming from out of technology, that's always the startup's first question. How do you get to scale? And so I'm kind of inclined to regard scale as the logic of the enemy. I find it an imperial logic. I find any question of scale, even the best intentioned, one that wants to, it's a templated way of thinking. It's about saying what worked here will work there, what worked then will work now. And I think that this is both disrespectful to the particularity of things, and I think it is to circumscribe our ability to mold things to present conditions and our own needs. So I look back at things like the Black Panther Survival Programs, which were extensive. I mean, they involved everything from free meals to health clinics, to community patrols. I looked at things like, the solidarity clinics in Greece, and the pharmacies in Greece during the crisis there, and municipalism in Spain, and the extremely ambitious attempt to transform an entire society in northeastern Syria, which is just recently and genuinely tragically been, I think, fairly finally curtailed, in what was happening in Rojava, an attempt to redesign an entire society on anarcho-feminist and eco-socialist principles. You look at all of these things that took place and you say, what can we learn from them? But not in any way that's about literally transposing their moves onto the fabric of our own experience. It's instead saying, okay, this gives us a repertoire. This gives us things that we might try. This gives us authorization to experiment, and also existence proof that under certain envelopes of conditions, you can in fact appropriate space, appropriate energy, set up a community clinic, do things that under ordinary terms seem well beyond the range of ordinary people to do. And you can do so very often in excess of anything that certainly the narratives of conventional life would credit, right? You can heal people, you can care for people, you can keep people from succumbing to the effects of organized abandonment. We can care and protect for one another. And in doing so, we can expand our ability to claim even further regions of sovereignty over the environment and over our own psychic and embodied selves in the world.
Yeah. There's a lot to kind of unpack there. Maybe quickly going back to the question of scale, I think that while there is that, I also have, that there is one thing about using scale as a question that helps you understand relations and nestedness of things.
Okay.
That the ways in which, just to kind of continue using London as in one of the examples, the way that kind of taxation system is written here, kind of really then for non-resident residents property really influences then both housing cost kind of situation here, but it also influences wealth acquiring habits in other parts of the world, or wealth protecting habits in the other parts of the world, and that it's impossible to, if we only focus on understanding the kind of housing crisis in London by thinking it through, what is the local condition, we don't see that if we don't. But that's quite a different kind of relationship with scale as a question than this push to scale up, push to overpower, which often has tendencies of like the idea that the world is at the moment, unfortunately, constituted with through who has more and who controls more. But I think it has this other way of understanding that it's a question of stability.
Mm,
That understanding that the fragility of where moment processes in which people who live in a neighborhood take claim on their own organization of life and planning what their what do they need. And in minor planning, I'm thinking around the question of like how we respond to this. And I kind of think through the federation, like what is, so recognizing
mm,
recognizing different life houses and potential, and then how do they relate each other. And then for me it seems that that's the one of the ways we approach how do we redesign cities
mm,
to
mm.
respond to contemporary pressure. And in this context, how do you see this? If you are to now think, what would be like if you are to kind of think, what are the next steps for Lifehouse
Mm.
as a proposition to city design? Where would you start,
Well, I think a lot
or where
about
would you like to end?
uh, I think a lot about this idea of stabilizing things, right? And there is a way in which I think it's the answer to the question that you had asked before about what happens when the moment of crisis and acute need passes. And I'm also a little bit suspicious of it because I believe in flux. I just as a personal matter of spiritual practice, I'm a Buddhist. I believe that all is change, and I think that the attempt to stabilize things ultimately is running up against some features of the universe that are fairly intractable. But how do you stabilize things without recourse to the logic of scale? I think you said the word. I think the word is federation. I think you begin to reach out to other initiatives and other entities that are doing similar things, that are facing similar challenges and responding in similar ways. And you reach toward them and they reach toward you, and you begin to acquire the ability to do mutual aid at a larger scale. It's really interesting. There's the when we say mutual aid, there's the Kropotkinian, the anarchist meaning of it, but there's another way in which the phrase mutual aid is invoked, which is by typically emergency service organizations of the state, like fire departments and medical systems. When there's an acute crisis in Mexico City, and they don't have dogs that are trained to sniff through wreckage and find corpses or people who are still alive there. People from Oakland fly down there. That's called mutual aid. People from Tulsa show up there, and vice versa, right? Like these emergency service departments have standing agreements for helping one another, and so they're able to exceed the capacity of any one of them when they call upon these networks. And I think that's the model of mutual aid and federation that I would be reaching for in the Lifehouse. Anytime you've established a physical site that's bounded, that is embodied, that is planted in a particular community, there will be moments where it has capacities in excess of what it can utilize locally at the moment, and there will be moments of need in which it's constrained in its ability to exercise its own control over its environment, needs to call upon resources from elsewhere. And I think having a loose, democratic, federated mesh of organizations that share the same values initiatives that same share the same kind of impulse towards autonomous and sovereign self-organization and self-realization should begin to more overtly make common cause with one another, like locally, regionally, national scale, international scale. I think that there should be venues for working out what it is that these entities have in common, what their common needs are, what their common understandings are, and to begin to work toward a common stating of what the moment requires of us and what values that drives. There's a chicken and an egg problem, of course, right?
But there isn't always a chicken and an egg
There's always a
problem,
chicken and egg problem.
especially if we approach transformation of a society into better place for a more through transforming what is already there and reconstituting relations and not just starting from scratch. To which extent are you, like, we are both kind of were really interested in the openings and limits of what common kind of introduction of commons is one of the kind of really important principles in thinking through urbanization, urbanism, and agency and empowerment of people, and kind of being part of these commons debates for 15, 20 years now. One thing that I started to kind of really understand that one of the problems of commons is that there is this clear identification in relation to how spaces look. So almost impossibility to
Yeah,
and coming from a very secular background, to which extent you're kind of afraid that, that in a way that the first space through which you think Lifehouse is a church, that there is that kind of a danger that people are like, well, we just don't have churches. What are we going to do? But more, I guess, where I'm also interested in thinking is how do we create these different imaginations
yeah,
that, as you say, that especially in relation to this digital overlay, which really serves us. We are not even conscious to which extent our desire of how things should look or what they should be
yeah,
are served through.
yeah. Um, I want to handle those questions separately. The first, I think, goes to the aestheticization of the commons. I personally get frustrated with the commons discourse because I found it to be extraordinarily inefficacious. I think that the people who have been at the core of discussing the commons over the last quarter century have done a frankly terrible job of explaining that to what we might call ordinary people, who are, after all, the people who are theoretically invoked by commons theory. I think that the language is unnecessarily arcane. I think that it just isn't, or doesn't seem to be, or doesn't seem to have been compelling as kind of a political granulation point or crystallizing point. People haven't really come together around the commons in defense of the commons in the way that we might have hoped. There's an exception to this, which I'll come back to. And what has happened instead has been an aestheticization of the commons. I call this the received commons aesthetic. It's sort of the physical and visual language of ad hoc self-organized spaces deployed in places that are nothing like that. So, I personally regard the greatest symbol of autonomous self-organization as the cheap monoblock chair, the plastic monoblock chair. It's sort of anywhere you go in the world that you see people actually gathering to discuss the issues that affect them acutely and to arrive at collective decisions around the destiny of their community together, you're going to find the monoblock chair. It really is, sort of the universal symbol of this stuff. What you will not find are the very consciously undesigned artifacts that you see in places where architects have been at work trying to deploy the vocabulary of appropriability and granular access to ordinary people. I mean, frankly, I love this aesthetic, right? Like, this is Raumleber Berlin. This is Zulu Arc, the architects that designed the kind of appropriable mobile furniture for the Campo de Tabata in Madrid. There's a vocabulary of kind of mobile, readily deployable furniture and sunscreens and pop-up structures and circular sitting arrangements. And this vocabulary itself is super readily appropriable by spaces which are not in any meaningful way commons. The language of ad hoc appropriation of space and self-organization. And people in London, you're familiar with Box Park in Shoreditch, right? Like, Box Park is sort of just an elaborate restatement of the use of ad hoc elements like shipping containers. Like, this vocabulary has been played for 20 years now. And it sort of, it gestures at ideas about access and appropriability, but it in the same sentence steps on them. It delivers total experiences that you don't really have any way of making your own. And so I think we need to resist the aestheticization of these moments. This is difficult for me, right? I have a strong aesthetic sense. I like things to look a certain way. Occupy Sandy did not look that way, right? It looked like a church with some banners hung around it. It wasn't. You have to let go of the idea that the revolution is going to look a particular way,
Uh,
because it turns out that the revolution happens in spaces that were not designed, that were appropriated, and that may be slowly reconfigured by the people using them, but don't really have any notable visual, distinct vocabulary or identifier.
just before I kind of respond, I would like to invite everyone who is on the call, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A, and this is your kind of. We really want kind of to hear your thoughts about some of these, or provocations about some of these things. I think that going back to, I think what is, I think, for me, how to balance that idea of things of necessity, things emerge out of necessity, with where I kind of find this concept of Kristen Ross communal luxury really important. That I think that Lifehouse for me is a beginning of a proposition of thinking that that not everything is about sustaining bare life,
Mm-hmm.
and that we kind of have to think of kind of that we can reorganize cities not around that those who get the best services get them because they are the most affluent, and then the less you have, the less services you have, but that through this organization of services in which people also claim their political agency, we also determine what is then, for lack of a better word, luxury, but that's not necessarily Kashmir all the way.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm reminded of an anecdote I always used to tell, which it turns out was actually scripted. I didn't know this. It's from a script, but it was a socialist reformer of the Edwardian era in the UK who was about to board a train and was asked by a muckraking reporter, do do you intend to abolish first class on the train? And he's like, no, I intend to abolish second class. And this is the notion. This is communal luxury. We should all have first class seats. We should all have, essentially business class, appointments and everything that we do. Everything should be nice. The public has the right to this, the most elaborate and the most caring deployments of our common wealth. Kristen uses this vocabulary of communal luxury that goes back to the Paris Commune. Other people talk about fully automated luxury communism,
which we don't need to open as a
we
topic
don't need to.
now. But there is a
But
question.
I want to push back against that. I think that the vocabulary of luxury in this context is itself an artifact of scarcity thinking. And what I'm trying to make a case for is difficult because it's much less appealing on the surface, which is sufficiency, which is satiety, which is enough.
Yeah.
The quantity of the quality in life of having enough, not of luxury, neither of austerity of bare life, nor communal luxury, but
Yeah.
simply having a decent standard for all.
Yeah, I think for me, I have a difficult relationship with the kind of luxury as a term, and I think that for me, it makes it's important to evoke Kristen Ross and communal luxury because it's not this what we expect of luxury, but I can't decouple luxury from extractivism in various different ways. And thrival for me is like thriving and surviving and thriving at the same time, which is Amanda Williams is. So we have two really interesting questions. So I'm going to ask. Yeah. So the first anonymous attendee asks, what do you think? I'll read them both. So because of the time, what do you think, if any, the role of local government is in making space for these kinds of projects? And Tom Harvey, welcome back. Tom also asked a really interesting question previous time, building on the question of whether crisis is necessary to catalyze widespread mutual aid, how might we intentionally initiate and sustain these practices through human agency? Drawing on historical precedents without nostalgia, can gift economies and commons governments sit alongside mutual aid, particularly in the context shaped by long-standing inequality? How do we begin? How do we sustain care over time? And how might these approaches be understood as context-specific or time-bound rather than universal solutions?
I have no way of knowing how to answer that. Let me hit the first question.
Well, there are actually more and more questions pouring out. So
Super. Okay, hit me with that first question again.
What's the role of, if any,
local
of the
government.
local government in making spaces for these kinds of projects?
So you probably won't be surprised to hear that I'm not a statist. But the argument that Lifehouse makes, the book Lifehouse, is a different argument. I am not going to go back and try and relitigate the argument that folks on the left have been having since the First International. I'm not here to say whether the state can or should afford us the makings of a decent and a dignified existence. The question is, the salient question, the question with teeth is, in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, is it likely that the state will do that? Right? Is the likelihood that the state will be here for us when we need it, when we need care? And my overwhelming feeling is that it will not be. And that's true for a variety of reasons. There's a bourgeois sense in which just at moments of acute crisis, it is not able to enact its responsibilities. There's a more radical sense in which through austerity, we see that the state has withdrawn from its stewardship over common resources and the commonwealth and distributing that in an equitable manner. And there's a still more radical sense in which the state is an active agent of oppression, and that we know that the idea of organized abandonment isn't simply the kind of retreat from provision, but it's an enhancement of certain other kinds of provision. It's an enhancement of security forces and state oppression of the precise kind that we see in the United States right now. So the role of local government is, yeah, help if you are inclined to, but otherwise get out of the way. It's amazing to me. Yeah, I was at this event a couple of years ago now in Sheffield. It was called Fearless Cities, South Yorkshire. And it was a gathering of the global municipalist community, libertarian municipalism. So people who you would think were not particularly inclined to statist perspective on things. And there was an exercise, there was a thought exercise, a workshop in which we were asked to imagine ourselves as a municipalist formation. So a bottom-up, participatory, deliberative body with dispositive power over a given community. How, if we were the assembly of such a thing, we would respond to an acute ecological crisis such as a flooding event. And the moderators, they would hit us with things like, okay, well, the Met Office has released this forecast. There's this torrential rainstorm that's 48 hours away. What kinds of provisions do you begin to make? What kinds of conversations do you have? And then 10 minutes into that, they hit us with, well, the storm is here. It's overwhelming. The streets are up to your waist. Everything is flooded. What kinds of conversation do you have now? And I have to say that people in this room, the mostly British people in this room, were like, well, we get on the phone to the council and we negotiate with them, their area of responsibility versus our own. And as somebody with material experience of Occupy Sandy, I was like, no, that's not what you do. You do not negotiate with the local government. You do what you need to do. You do what the moment requires of you. You take the bolt cutters, you cut the fence, you steal the power, you steal the supplies, if that's what it takes to take care of your community. And I would have thought that was relatively uncontroversial. And instead, what I found was this really marked resistance to the idea of genuine autonomy, even among people who are nominally sort of signatory to this autonomous way of doing things. Local government, our local labor councillor here is a good friend of mine. She's a wonderful person. I think she wants to make things available for people. I think she has a genuine commitment to justice and equity and redistribution. But she doesn't have sway in all the ways that we might like. And when things get heated, when things get intense, you need to act on your own behalf. You really do. You need to not wait for authorization. You need to not wait for the color of authority. In the popular expression, you need to ask forgiveness later instead of permission beforehand. And maybe even that forgiveness is not necessary.
And I think what here is also important, and I'm really conscious that we are over time already, and we still kind of didn't come to music, and there are 9 more questions is that I think it's also really easy to, slip into thinking immediately into this emergency mode. Because, your examples are always around what do? You cut the bolts. But I think that there is a way of how do we claim we not wait for local government or any government to provide something, but there is how do one produces a political agency which then says we are using this space and we need these type of spaces and you have these type of spaces in your ownership, but we are going to manage them and govern them not as you as public institution, but as what in Croatia they've developed this kind of common power, like common benefit society or relief. And so I think the relationship with the government is always a contentious, but it is a a space where design also happens in relation. How do you create those relations so that it's not, and recognizing that local councils also do have some dispositions. Sometimes they have properties they own and they don't know what to do because they are sitting vacant and they only
Sure.
thinking about making money and all this. So I think there are all these ways in which Lifehouse as a proposal then helps us see and push this. And then,
I mean, I think
uh,
this is a way of responding to that second question. I
yeah.
mean, so let me say certainly, like when the local authority is in the hands of a political tendency that's congenial to these aspirations, then by all means, have what I think of as a trans-institutional common will, right? Like they'll do what they can, you do what you can, you work together towards some region of agreement. You might not agree about everything, you might not agree, they might not even be able to publicly affirm some of what they're doing, but you can work in your different ways towards a broad area of common agreement. More often than not, the local authority will not be in the hands of people who are congenial to this perspective. And that's when you really do need to fall back on your own initiative. To the second question,
Well,
I,
Adam, I'm conscious that we have around five. We are 5 10 minutes over, and
are we
maybe
doing
we
time limits?
some time limits, yes. But
Okay.
maybe before should we read all the other questions, or do
Yeah,
you
sure.
wanna?
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
do you? Because I think a lot of these kind of some of the aspects kind of come together, and I
Yeah.
think so. AZ asks, why do you think a practice of mutual care did not emerge as the state retreated from the ongoing COVID pandemic? It seems to me that the sense of collective well-being that was on many people's tongues was quietly swallowed by everyone after the state stopped intervening. In the UK, we see the rise of anti-immigrant sentiments, and
Wait,
it really seems
is this a new question?
it's the same.
Same.
And it seems like everyone has accepted that some people are not worth saving and are desperate to find themselves on the correct side of the line. So the following question from Cameron Downs. I would love to hear both of your thoughts on the warning signs of the co-optation by the market, mutual aid projects, greenwashing. Figures it always be to be viewed negatively. How do we avoid it, if so? Anna Mendez Hernandez. Hi, Anna. For me, the question of scale is importantly related with the possibility of providing supporting structures for the commons, communalism, self-governing. So understanding scaling as a propagating closer to Anna Tsing's idea of how mushrooms cannot be planned, but there are situations when they grow and others when they just don't. I thank you, Anna, for this really important kind of
Conditions of
addition
possibility.
to this
Yeah.
conversation around questions of federation uh, and stability, not as ossification, but as existence, durational existence over time. Marvin Tejeda asks, how can we make concept of sustainability affordable and accessible to masses? Say, for example, vertical towers having vertical forests, but actual units are way not affordable
Oh,
for
that one
common.
I can dispense with immediately. There's no such thing as sustainability. All right, come on. Go on.
Another question from Anonymous NTD. How would the Lifehouse be able to serve people equitably? And the last of the questions we have, Helen Cook wanted to let us know about some projects she's working on. Resilience Web is a visual directory of community groups in place, and we are running a series called How Resilient is Cambridge, which is a series of 6 events focused on food, flooding, energy, etc., and asks what sort of emergency we should be preparing for in Cambridge. We want to ultimately organize local response centers, organizing hubs, neighborhood-sized projects using many of the ideas from a Lifehouse. Thank you, Helen, for this. So, yes, I think that there is a lot, kind of a common thread within these questions, which also point to that. For me, that is understanding that these are really also situated things, and there is no, and that a lot is also kind of learning from other examples and trialing out. And a lot is then about one of the ways to constitute a community around something is allowing that community to determine the rules of their
Mm,
own engagement.
mm.
And that I think is maybe connected to the kind of Lifehouse as
Yeah,
a
I love, I mean, Anna, thank you for introducing the language of propagation because that's exactly the language I reach for. I think that our version of scale is propagation and pollination and cross fertilization. And I think that's about helping to create the conditions of possibility for the achievement of self-organization by precisely that, sharing our repertoire of tricks and tips and tactics, not with the idea that all of them are going to be, identically implementable in a different context, but with the idea that people kind of try them on for size and see what works for them and what doesn't. I'm going to propose this. Those questions are so rich and so deep that I'm actually going to propose that we do another session to answer them because I
Yeah.
don't want to rush. I don't want to give them short shrift. I don't want to give them glib answers. I'm tempted to in a couple of cases, but I'm not. I'm going to resist that tendency. And if you'll indulge me, I would like to come back on a further on a future occasion that you have the time because I think they're actually worth getting into. There's a lot of richness and depth and meat in those questions, and I don't want to just kind of blow through them. The one thing I will say, I think we need to be really, really wary of language like sustainability and resilience. I don't use either one of those terms. I think that they are, again, logics of the enemy. Resilience, we don't talk about because resilience we define as the capacity of a complex system to resume its current state of function after it's been exposed to some exogenous shock. And I think most of us on this call probably agree that the status quo is not something that we want to return to. The inequitable, unjust state of affairs that we live with or the distribution of resources that we live with is not something that we want to retain or see restored. So I'm not at all interested in resilience in that sense. I don't think we should snap back to this. I think we should aim at becoming something different. As for sustainability, I don't think there's a single thing that we're doing as a society that is, in fact, sustainable. I am notoriously prone to underestimate the tenacity of the way things are. I've been expecting things to fall apart for 15 years now. So things have more tenacity in them than I think that we understand. But if you've seen this report that was leaked a couple of days back by the heads of the UK's security apparatus, they expect large-scale societal delamination to occur as a consequence of the way in which ordinary, everyday, late capitalism uses resources. And they're expecting that more or less imminently. That's terrifying. Nothing that we're doing is sustainable. The only upside to that really is that we have a wholesale chance to rethink the ways in which we interact with one another and the ways in which we interact with our environment. And that goes to the necessity of what James C. Scott calls anarchist calisthenics, ways of practicing being in the world ahead of the moment that we'll need them. I'm going to leave things there because I do think that we need a full hour to kind of
Yes.
engage those
So
questions.
no. So I guess in 2 weeks' time, city design and conversation minor planning continues with the conversation with David McEwen from Unit 38, who will discuss their proposition of a people's design service and how they actually develop some kind of conditions of planning which enable Lifehouse to exist. David has just been appointed as London's mayor advisor for design, so it would be interesting to
Sweet.
see how he is planning to use this role to propagate some of these ideas, so that there is more affinity towards non-market solutions and non-blanket easy solutions, because I think if everything we have kind of see is that the task of redesigning cities so that they can sustain us in the future is really an iterative task in which we also have to constantly not only negotiating how we work together, but also to make sure that we understand what is the language that we mean by the same things that by the language we use. And I do think that there is a lot of more kind of common ground between people building resilience hubs in Cambridge and you, Adam, even though I do also share this distrust of the term resilience because it has been given to us by the top-down idea, and I'm not the whole point of minor planning is to change the status quo towards something that works better for everyone. Thank you all so much for this incredible engagement. Thank you, Adam. I think that if you are open, we can reconvene in this same time in a month's time.
Yeah.
To give a lot of kind of time to do. I have saved all your questions, and we can do a follow-up conversation, which will be my opportunity to also ask my last question, which was who will clean the Lifehouse.
I
So
will.
let's do the session in which we really practically unpack what is this
Yeah, I'd love to.
proposition. And
Talk to
my
me.
last question in all of these sessions is always about music.
Okay.
It's mostly because I have realized that I've negotiated my belonging in cities I feel I belong to, my hometown Niš, Belgrade, and now London, through music, through spending time, going to kind of concerts and parties and places where you listen music together with others. And I do think that there is a lot we can learn about what the cities can be and what life can be through music. So can you just tell us what is your kind of offering back to us to this prompt about what is the music you want to throw to us? Give us.
You know
For
me.
my playlist, city design, minor planning, city design, and conversation, because I realized I should make a playlist for all the answers I've got
Um,
now.
you know perfectly well that I have a real affinity for extreme metal. And I think that the metal community is exemplary in a great many ways. It is despite the foreboding appearance and the intimidating aesthetics, and for some people the almost risible juvenility that seems to sheath it. It is an incredibly affirming and an incredibly diverse and welcoming community, including modes and registers of diversity that are very, very often overlooked in other nominally subcultural spaces. I find that one of the beautiful things about London's metal community is that when you go to an extreme or an experimental metal show here, you will see people from their late teens into very often their 70s and once or twice even their 90s. There are people who relate to the question of ability in all sorts of ways and have all kinds of embodied ways and frames of experiencing the everyday. I find that heavy music is one of the most cogent responses to the ecological and social moment we find ourselves in. And so if there's a track that I would commend to you for your playlist, it is Living is Easy by the ecstatic black metal band Agriculture out of Los Angeles.
So I've pasted a YouTube link. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks
Please
everybody
join
for your
us
questions. Thank
in
you,
2 weeks
Duby.
in the conversation with David, and also then in 4 weeks, Adam and I will meet again
Yeah,
to plan the Lifehouse,
I think that's
to minor
splendid.
plan the Lifehouse.
Uh,
Thank you so much, and
Thanks everybody for your
yeah.
questions. It's wonderful. Take care. Bye.